Chapter 21, Hittin The Road Fulltime. As mentioned earlier, the whole playing field changed once I walked out of CNN. When the initial shock had diminished, it was just a matter of regrouping and heading in a new direction. A friend actually put it in perspective for me by telling me not to dwell on the job loss, but to just move on and begin to live the dream. It was good advice. Now there would be more dues to be paid, plenty of road miles, motels, club owners, waffle houses, idiots in the audience, instruments to maintain, booking agents, scheduling conflicts, songs to write, CDs to record, and the list goes on. This is where the quote I remembered by Hunter S. Thompson really rang true. The music business is a cruel and shallow money trench, a long plastic hallway where thieves and pimps run free, and good men die like dogs. There's also a negative side. To be fair, there were always certain people we'd meet in the different towns along the way that stood out of the crowd and would always be there to support us. Those were always the ones that would get it. They were a select few and were appreciated more than they ever realized. This scenario came about unexpectedly. In 1998, my wife Jolie thought I needed a better way to travel. She went out on a limb to purchase a slightly used 1998 Winnebago Brave 31-foot Class A motorhome. It would be a great way for three musicians to travel comfortably while in turn saving lots of money on lodging. It really worked well for quite a while, covering the majority of the U.S. and Canada for about 5 years. It was really practical for long road trips, but for local appearances, not so much. There were some great adventures in the motorhome. One tour that comes to mind was the time the band and I were out for about a month in the West and Midwest. We experienced every type of weather change possible. We started off with spring-like weather in Indiana and Missouri on the way to Colorado. During a Friday night gig in Denver, it snowed 3 inches before we were done that night. That's not unusual for Denver, but the fact that we had to head out over the Rockies overnight after the gig for a show the next day in western Colorado made it a little disconcerting. As we escalated higher into the mountains, the snowflakes increased in size, becoming the size of baseballs. The further we traveled, the deeper the accumulation. Attached to the motorhome was a standard flatbed car hauler with my Chevy S10 pickup strapped to it. The whole rig was about 50 feet long. My thought was to just take it easy in the snowfall, even if it meant going 20 miles an hour the whole way. No sudden moves or accelerations permitted. Since there were large matrix signs along the way warning large vehicles to be equipped with snow chains, of which I had none, it was more than necessary to proceed with caution. At this point, the plows hadn't even been on the road yet. It was me and the Winnebago playing Lewis and Clark by being the first to blaze a trail through the Rockies, albeit by making the first snow tracks that night anyway. We made it across the Great Divide and out of the Eisenhower Tunnel at dawn safely. After descending the 7-mile, 7% grade and coasting into Silverthorne, Colorado, where the unpleasant dominant local aroma is burning brakes, we pulled over and went to sleep. After Colorado, a day or two later, it was down to Texas for a gig near Houston. While making good time across the Lone Star State on a hot day, a total opposite from the more than mile-high blizzard, I recalled noticing that one of the inside rear dual tires was looking a little low and that it should be checked. No sooner did I think about it did that tire blow, and of course it couldn't just be a flat tire, it had to take the muffler with it. Now here we are, on the side of a long lonesome Texas highway with maybe a hint of cell phone signal. This was Friday afternoon with a gig waiting for us outside of Houston that evening. If we blew this one, it would be a real financial, not to mention a career drain. Now I'm on the phone trying to get Good Sam, the motorhome version of AAA, to get us up and running. As the cell signal would come and go, I was intermittently talking to several different entities, including the Texas Rangers. After a while, different folks had reports of our dilemma, but it was still uncertain if anyone had enough information to actually find us. During this time, a strapping large gentleman in a 3/4-ton pickup truck and wearing a hat as big as Texas was signaling to me from way across the road in front of his ranch entrance. Since he was evidently hard of hearing, I had run across the highway to speak to him. He was a towering but gentlemanly ranch owner who gave me his card and told me that if help hadn't arrived after a while to come up and find him. After another hour or so, I decided to take him up on his offer. When I started hiking up the road to his ranch, after about a quarter mile, I still saw no sign of human habitation and turned back to the motorhome. God only knows how far back his property went. I immediately decided that I should take advantage of the remaining time. It was obvious that the Winnebago would have to be towed somewhere. In realizing that, I decided to roll the S10 pickup off the flatbed trailer, detach the trailer from the motorhome, and then reattach it to the pickup truck. Since most of our stage gear was in the camper shell of the truck, this would enable us to move fast and still make the gig outside of Houston, even if it meant leaving the motorhome on the side of the road. The show must go on, as they say. At least now the Winnebago was in position to be towed should that ever happen. I was really hoping that putting a mailbox up right there and becoming a permanent Texas resident would be the absolute last resort. Before actually making the decision to leave the house on the side of the road, my only other alternative was now to just go back and sit in the driver's seat of the Winnebago to ponder and pray on what step to take. This is when things got interesting. As I was leaning over the wheel with my head in my hands and wondering what to do next, a loud noise startled me. A large tractor trailer, towing a long flatbed trailer, was passing by slowly and closely on the left. It then pulled off onto the shoulder in front of the motorhome, requiring a moment for me to actually fathom what was happening. As it started backing up, the front of the trailer was also raising up and forming an incline. When I saw the huge winch chain, I finally realized that help had just arrived. The driver emerged from the cab and immediately started hooking the chain to the front of the Winnebago. In trying to determine if I was still dreaming or if this was really happening, he told me he was the owner of a garage about 40 miles back in Lufkin, Texas. He said he was about 40 miles beyond that point when he received the call about us being stranded. This guy had come 80 miles to rescue us from fading into obscurity. The motorhome was on the flatbed and fastened down in a matter of seconds. The big rig driver then told us to follow him back to his garage about 40 miles back on the same highway. How glad was I now that I had thought enough in advance to rearrange the truck and trailer in order to expedite whatever I didn't know might happen. And following the tractor trailer with the Winnebago strapped on, he was down the road in a cloud of smoke. He had to be running at least 90. I couldn't keep up with my foot to the floor anymore, and my feet would have been flapping underneath the vehicle like Fred Flintstone. When we finally arrived at the garage, I told this gentleman that I had never seen my motorhome go that fast. We then assessed what repairs would be made and left the flatbed trailer at the shop. The two other band members and I headed down toward Houston in my Chevy S10 pickup and actually made the gig on time. While the money was okay for the night, unfortunately the gig was quite uneventful, with it being the typical room full of drunk idiots. We were back on the road to the garage early the next morning, with the only stop being a quick one through the McDonald's drive-thru for breakfast. While back at the garage settling up the repair bill, which turned out to be very reasonable, I asked these guys how they were able to pull off our timely service call and rescue. The owner and the office manager both said they had a running joke around the shop. They told me, "We know that around 2 p.m. on a Friday afternoon we're going to get a call for a motorhome. Knowing firsthand what it's like to be stranded, we always do everything we can to help folks in need." This was Texas hospitality at its finest. I made it a point later to send a CD to the folks at the garage. Also included was a signed photograph thanking them for the help and adding, "I never saw my motorhome go that fast." The band and I made it in plenty of time to our gig that next night in Natchez, Mississippi. Although this was a trying 48 hours, thankfully, we never missed a beat. In early 2004, it occurred to me that downsizing to a regular van to occasionally tow a travel trailer on the road with a band when necessary would be the way to go. When telling Jolie what I thought I should do, once again she jumped into action. She immediately found a 2003 Chevy Express 2500 van with 27,000 miles on it. In the meantime, a good friend of mine who was an RV salesman at a large Florida dealership set me up with a suitable pull-behind unit. Having a short window of one day to pull this all together, I had to act quickly. I closed on the trailer in Tampa on Tuesday morning, drove the Winnebago motorhome back to Atlanta that afternoon, signed for the Chevy van while having it configured for towing on Wednesday morning, and then drove it back to Tampa that night in order to be at a gig in St. Petersburg on Thursday. There was no margin for error whatsoever. This new concept proved to work well. The gear could be carried in the van while the trailer could be used when necessary on the road. At the same time, I was starting to employ local musicians in various areas around the country, since it was becoming more and more impossible for my regular players to be gone for long periods of time. One afternoon a year or so later, while parked at a club in Kansas in the summer of 2006, I received a phone call from a major RV resort company offering me a free membership to their RV resort network, along with a free visit to one of their properties. They had obtained my name from my having just purchased another trailer, this one considerably smaller since I was now traveling alone. While it sounded at first like a timeshare sales pitch, it had a different ring to it. Since I was headed west to Arizona and California, my question was if there was something in either state that would be in my direction of travel. There was one about 2 hours north of Phoenix, which would work out perfectly since it was about only 30 minutes from my gig at a brewery in Oak Creek Canyon. The RV resort I would visit nearby was Verde Valley RV Park, a property managed by Chicago-based company Equity Lifestyle Corporation. When I was informed that the company hired musicians at their properties around the country, this seemed like as good opportunity as any to think out of the box in order to make an escape from nightclubs and the usual roadhouse trenches. One thing led to another. After leaving some music behind for consideration, I was then put in touch with a national recreation director, and in turn, my name was passed on to various resort managers around the U.S. This was a great opportunity to perform for an audience that I would never otherwise come in contact with. It would be a more family-oriented singer-songwriter type of atmosphere as opposed to the usual rooms full of stumbling and babbling drunks. The states I would eventually travel to over the next 10 years to perform in RV parks would be Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona, Texas, Nevada, Indiana, Ohio, Tennessee, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. This would be the majority of my touring, along with various blues festivals here and there. At least having to play bars less frequently made this a very appealing alternative. I can now count on one hand the number of joints I would have to venture into. If I played another bar or restaurant, it was because the owner and I had become good friends as a result of our years of working together. Now it was my choice whether or not I wanted to be there. The first few years of the RV culture had me going out for at least 4 to 6 months at a time, but it did require me to have to be in a different joint every night. The nightly pay for a solo act was much better than the usual joint wages, making nights off in between gigs a little more enjoyable. It also allowed for traveling the 2-lane back roads and somewhat neglected but very scenic U.S. highways instead of the constant and unending interstate grind. This led to more sightseeing and being able to actually stop and smell the roses along the way. What made this more feasible was the memory I had of having to be at a gig in Iowa on the way back from Canada in 1998. During the 12-hour drive each day for 3 days with no margin for error, we had driven through the Black Hills of South Dakota at night. Think about what I just described. We saw nothing. I remember thinking that during the drive that somehow, somewhere, sometime, something had to give. Somewhere between 2010 and 2011, the constant road warrior identity I carried for so many years, then and now, was beginning to wear off. I finally narrowed my journeys down to a handful of parks that really embraced what I did and to those where I enjoyed performing. I could now tour when and where I wanted to. This left a lot more time now for doing some creative projects I had been putting off, such as songwriting, recording, teaching, constructing a few guitar instruction websites, and just playing gigs of my own choosing. No longer would I have to be a prisoner of the highway. My choice now is to be home more often than not.